Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really thrilled you could join us today because we are taking a fascinating journey through a really compelling piece of historical and theological rhetoric.
Yeah, we are. And whether you're a theology buff, a history enthusiast, or honestly just someone who is intensely curious about how ancient ideas shape human behavior, you're going to find a lot to chew on here.
Right, absolutely. So today we're analyzing a very powerful sermon, and it really hinges on one very bold, very clear thesis, which is simply this: the word renews and restores the covenant people.
It's a sweeping claim. And what makes this particular piece of rhetoric so interesting to analyze is how the speaker sets out to prove that thesis.
Yeah.
The sermon doesn't just offer an abstract philosophical argument about human nature. Instead, it takes you on a chronological journey through three major historical milestones in the biblical narrative.
Which is such a great way to structure it.
Yeah, exactly. It travels from the imposing, thundering heights of Mount Sinai down into the chaotic courts of the temple in Jerusalem, and finally arrives at the stark reality of a Roman execution stake at Calvary.
It is an epic roadmap. And our mission today is to trace that central theme through all three of those locations, pulling out the most important historical and psychological insights along the way.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get to the first stop on that historical road trip, we really need to define this word covenant.
We do, yeah.
Because we use that term today in very dry legal ways, right? Like a neighborhood housing covenant or a corporate contract. But this sermon seems to be operating on a completely different frequency.
Yeah, and that distinction is really the foundational premise of everything we are going to discuss today. The sermon draws a hard line here. A covenant in the ancient Near Eastern sense is not merely an agreement.
It's not a contract.
Right, exactly. Think about a modern contract. A contract is inherently transactional. It says, you do this for me and I will do this for you.
Right.
And if you fail to deliver your end of the bargain, the contract is voided and we walk away. But a covenant is deeply relational. It is a sacred, permanent binding of two parties.
Almost like the traditional concept of a marriage rather than a business deal. You are binding yourselves together, creating a new family unit.
That is a perfect analogy. Unwavering loyalty is expected. However, the central conflict outlined in this sermon, and really the central conflict of human history according to this worldview, is that people constantly drift away from this bond.
Human nature just kind of takes over.
Exactly. They get distracted, they compromise, they lose the plot. And because the bond is meant to be permanent and sacred, that inevitable human drift requires a mechanism for correction.
So when the people drift, the sermon argues that a divine intervention is required to pull them back.
Yes. God sends his word to correct, renew, and restore.
So if the foundational problem is human drift, where does the sermon point us first to see this covenant in action? I know the narrative takes us all the way back to the book of Exodus, specifically chapter 20.
Right, the setup.
Yeah, the setup. To set the scene for you listening, the Israelites have just been delivered from 4 centuries of brutal, multi-generational slavery in Egypt.
And massively traumatized population.
Exactly. They have crossed the sea, they are navigating this harsh wilderness, and they've finally arrived at the base of Mount Sinai. This is the moment where this covenant is officially established through the 10 Commandments. But I noticed the sermon points out something really interesting about how that interaction starts. God doesn't just hand down a list of demands, does he?
No, he doesn't. What's fascinating here is the psychological framing of that moment. If you're dealing with a population of newly freed slaves, their entire existence has been defined by arbitrary rules, quotas, and the whips of taskmasters.
Right.
So if a divine being suddenly shows up and hands them a heavy list of new rules to earn their freedom, that just looks like a new form of slavery.
It's just a new boss.
Exactly. But the speaker highlights that the preamble to the commandments completely subverts that expectation. It begins with a statement of relationship. The text says, "I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage."
Wow, so that is a massive paradigm shift right there.
It really is.
The rescue was already an accomplished fact. It's essentially saying, you already belong to me, I already saved you. Now, here is the blueprint for how we live together.
By establishing that relationship right out of the gate, it changes the entire nature of the rules that follow. The sermon argues that these commandments were never meant to be restrictive chains.
Wow.
They're described as a covenant guide for holy living. If you think back to your marriage analogy, these aren't oppressive rules. They are the necessary boundaries that keep the relationship healthy, safe, and flourishing.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't have a thriving society if everyone is just doing whatever they want at the expense of others.
No, you can't.
And the sermon organizes these guidelines into two distinct categories, right?
Yeah.
It does. It breaks them down into vertical and horizontal relationships. The first category governs the vertical relationship with God.
So that's the rules about having no other gods, prohibiting the worship of idols.
All right, treating the divine name with reverence and keeping the Sabbath holy.
And the second category?
That governs the horizontal relationships, how these newly freed people are supposed to treat each other. That covers honoring parents and prohibitions against murder, adultery, stealing, lying, and coveting what your neighbor has.
It's a comprehensive moral foundation for a society starting from scratch. But here is where that concept of grift re-enters the picture.
Ah, yes, the inevitable drift.
The sermon highlights this tragic pivot in the historical narrative. Over the centuries, the Israelites lost the core of what this agreement was about. The speaker uses a phrase that really caught my attention. They say the people kept the form of religion, but forgot the spirit of obedience.
That is a brilliant distillation of the problem. Keeping the form of religion means you're still showing up to the festivals, you're still offering the sacrifices, you are checking all the external boxes.
But the spirit of obedience.
Right, that actual living relationship, that unwavering loyalty we talked about, has completely flatlined. It becomes an empty shell. You're doing the chores of the relationship, but the love is gone.
It's the ultimate spiritual complacency. You're treating the covenant like a vending machine. You put in the correct coin, like a sacrifice or a prayer, and you expect God to dispense a blessing.
And that hollowed out, transactional version of religion is exactly what sets the stage for the massive disruption we see in the second major milestone of this sermon.
Which fast forwards us hundreds of years into the future, landing in the Gospel of John, chapter 2. The scene shifts from the desolate wilderness of Sinai to the absolute epicenter of the ancient Jewish world, Jerusalem, during the festival of Passover.
A completely different environment.
Totally. Millions of pilgrims are flooding into the city. Jesus enters the temple, which is the architectural embodiment of this ancient covenant. It's supposed to be the most sacred space on earth. But what does he actually walk into?
To understand the shock of this scene, we have to understand the logistics of a first century Passover. You have people traveling from all over the known world. They can't bring sacrificial animals with them on a weeks-long journey.
Right, that would be impossible.
So they have to buy them at the temple. Furthermore, they have to pay a temple tax, but they can only pay it in a specific local currency, which means money changers are set up to exchange Roman or Greek coins, often at heavily inflated exploitative rates.
So imagine walking into a soaring, quiet cathedral expecting a moment of profound spiritual reflection, and instead you find a bustling stock exchange and a noisy petting zoo right in the lobby.
Yes.
It smells like livestock, people are haggling over exchange rates, and the entire atmosphere is dripping with commercialism.
The contrast to the reverence of Mount Sinai could not be more stark. The holy space meant for prayer and communion has been transformed into a bazaar. And this provokes a reaction from Jesus that often startles people who are only familiar with the very passive, gentle teacher imagery often portrayed in popular culture.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He doesn't just shake his head in disappointment or go find a manager to complain to.
Not at all.
The narrative describes him taking pieces of cord, weaving them together into a makeshift whip, and physically driving the merchants and the livestock out of the temple courts. He is overturning the heavy tables of the money changers, sending coins scattering across the stone floor, shouting at them to get out and to stop turning his father's house into a marketplace.
The sheer intensity and chaos of that moment must have been breathtaking.
Just explosive.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we realize this was far more than a sudden loss of temper. Jesus wasn't acting as an overzealous janitor trying to tidy up a physical building. The sermon argues that he was actively confronting and dismantling what the religion had devolved into.
It's that direct confrontation with the drift.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He's restoring true worship. The speaker describes the situation in Jerusalem as ritual without reverence, sacrifice without sincerity, and worship without holiness.
Sacrifice without sincerity, that is such an evocative phrase. It implies that a person can do all the right things externally, follow all the rules laid out at Sinai, and still completely miss the point.
And by driving out the merchants, Jesus is fiercely protecting the core of the covenant. He's demanding a return to true worship. But the aftermath of this event introduces a deeply cryptic moment.
Right, because naturally, the temple authorities are furious.
Oh, they are livid.
Ah,
They demand to know what gives him the authority to come in and disrupt the economic and religious center of their world. They demand a sign.
and his response is incredibly confusing to the people standing there. He looks at them and says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, the people hearing this are looking around at a massive complex of stone and gold that has taken decades to build. They think he is talking about the literal architecture. They think he's completely out of his mind.
But the sermon clarifies the underlying theology here. It points out that the biblical text later explains Jesus spoke of the temple of his body. This is perhaps one of the most monumental paradigm shifts in the entire narrative.
How so?
Well, to a first-century mind, the temple was where heaven and earth intersected. It was the literal dwelling place of the divine.
So to say I am the new temple is a staggering claim.
Staggering and incredibly dangerous. He is essentially announcing that the physical building, with all its elaborate courts and continuous altars, is becoming obsolete. The presence of the divine is moving from a geographical location to a living person.
Wow.
Furthermore, the phrase, "destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," is interpreted as a direct prophecy regarding his own impending death and resurrection. The argument being made is that through this ultimate sacrifice, the covenant would be permanently restored.
Which creates an enormous narrative cliffhanger. The temple is cleansed, the promise of a new living temple is made. But the mechanics of how this is actually going to work are still a mystery. How does the execution of one person accomplish what centuries of laws, rituals, and sacrifices entirely failed to do?
And to answer that, the sermon takes us to the third and final historical milestone, pivoting from the Gospels to the letters of the Apostle Paul.
We're moving into 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and this section serves as the philosophical climax of the sermon's argument. Paul is writing to people living in Corinth, which was a very wealthy, cosmopolitan, Greco-Roman city.
It was a culture that, in many ways, mirrors modern Western society. The sermon points out that the Greco-Roman world valued wisdom, power, political influence, and high philosophy.
Right. They celebrated the persuasive orator, the victorious military general, the brilliant stoic thinker.
Exactly. In their worldview, if the divine existed and wanted to act in the world, it would obviously operate with overwhelming, undeniable dominance and logic.
But the sermon highlights that the method chosen for this grand restoration was completely countercultural. It was a method the world considered not just weak, but utterly foolish. The focal point of this renewal is the cross.
And we have to remember how shocking that is. Today, people wear crosses as gold jewelry. But to a first-century Roman or Greek, a crucifixion was the ultimate symbol of defeat, shame, and absolute powerlessness.
It was a humiliating, agonizing execution method reserved for slaves and enemies of the state. It was designed to erase a person's dignity.
This raises an important question. Why would a divine being use an instrument of torture, something seen as profoundly humiliating, as the mechanism to renew humanity? Why not just use overwhelming cosmic power or an airtight philosophical argument?
Right. What does the text say?
The sermon provides Paul's answer. He writes, "For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us who are saved it is the power of God."
It completely flips the world's definition of power upside down.
Precisely. The argument is that this method proves human renewal cannot happen through human effort. It doesn't happen through our own philosophical brilliance, our military might, or our man-made religious systems.
Because if it did, we'd just take the credit for it.
Exactly. If humanity could save itself through strict adherence to laws or through high philosophy, humanity would get the credit. By using the cross, the ultimate symbol of human weakness and degradation, it becomes an undeniable display of what the text calls the wisdom of God. It bypasses human ego entirely.
The sermon lays out the theology of what is actually happening at that cross, presenting it as the ultimate covenant reset. The claim is that Jesus bore the sins of the people, effectively taking on the penalty for all that historical drift we've been talking about.
Right.
By doing so, he fulfilled the requirements of the law that was handed down back on Mount Sinai and established a brand new covenant. The result, according to this tradition, is that sinners are forgiven and hearts are fundamentally transformed.
It is a brilliant synthesis of the previous two milestones.
It really ties it all together.
It does. Think about it. At Mount Sinai, the perfect standard of the relationship was set, but human nature proved incapable of maintaining it. At the temple in Jerusalem, the corruption of human religious effort was exposed and violently rejected.
Yeah.
But at the cross, the ultimate penalty for breaking the bond is paid, and the spiritual power to actually live out the relationship is finally provided. The sermon concludes that the covenant people are restored, not through rules, but through the living word made flesh and crucified.
We have journeyed from the thundering mountain to the chaotic marketplace to the brutal execution stake. We've seen the relationship defined, the religion corrected, and the ultimate sacrifice made. But for you, the listener, tuning in while you're commuting or folding laundry or prepping for a meeting.
Yeah, the application.
Right. So what does this all mean? How does a theological argument about ancient history apply to the reality of your life right now?
That is the crucial transition any good piece of rhetoric must make. And the speaker doesn't leave the audience stranded in the past. The sermon bridges the gap between antiquity and the present day by outlining 3 specific pillars.
Okay.
These are the 3 ways the speaker claims the word continues to actively operate in the modern era to renew the covenant people.
The first of those pillars is revealing the standard. The argument is that just as the 10 Commandments revealed a standard of holiness to the Israelites, these ancient texts still act as a mirror today.
Exactly.
They show a person where their life is aligned with this sacred bond, and where they have drifted into selfishness or destructive behavior. It presents the idea that there is, in fact, an objective standard for a healthy life.
And following the logic of the sermon, once that standard is revealed, a person inevitably realizes how far short they fall. Which brings us to the second pillar, cleansing the heart.
Okay, this connects back to the temple.
Yes. Here, the speaker draws a direct psychological parallel back to Jesus in the temple courts. Just as he drove out the physical merchants who were exploiting the holy space, this message is meant to act internally. It's designed to drive out internal corruption, hypocrisy, and what the sermon profoundly labels spiritual complacency.
Let's talk about that phrase, spiritual complacency, because that feels incredibly relevant even outside a strictly religious context.
Oh, absolutely.
It's the modern equivalent of keeping the form but losing the spirit.
Yeah.
It's going through the motions of your life, your relationships, or your values without actually caring anymore. It's when you start treating your most important commitments as mere transactions.
It's a very easy trap to fall into. The argument here is that the message of this text is meant to metaphorically flip the tables in your own mind when you get too comfortable in that complacency.
I love that imagery, flipping the tables in your own mind.
And when a person realizes they need that internal cleansing, the sermon introduces the third and final pillar, pointing to the cross.
The speaker insists that ultimate restoration doesn't come from a person just trying harder, reading more self-help books, or wallowing in guilt. The theology presented is that true forgiveness, redemption, and a completely restored relationship come exclusively through the historical event of the cross.
It's presented as a comprehensive process of renewal. The standard shows you where you are misaligned, the cleansing clears out the internal hypocrisy, and the cross provides the ultimate healing and reset for the relationship.
Which brings the sermon to its final call to action for the listener. The speaker isn't just asking the audience to nod along and agree with a history lesson. It is a challenge to adopt a specific way of living.
Yes.
The sermon calls for a life marked by repentance, obedience, and what it calls covenant faithfulness, which, going back to our earlier analogy, means living with the deep, unconditional commitment and unwavering loyalty that you would expect in the strongest of marriages.
It is an invitation to abandon the transactional view of the universe and step fully back into a sacred relational bond. And that beautifully summarizes the entire thesis we started with, the argument that this divine word is the active power that renews and restores people.
What an incredibly rich journey through these ancient texts. We started at the base of Mount Sinai, watching a newly freed people receive the moral blueprint for their society, learning that the relationship always precedes the rules.
Right.
Then we jumped into the sensory overload of the temple in Jerusalem, watching a fierce protection of that relationship against the hollow, exploitative marketplace of empty religion. And finally, we arrived at Calvary, exploring the profound paradox that what the Greco-Roman world considered absolute foolishness is, according to this worldview, the ultimate power to transform the human heart.
It is a remarkably cohesive narrative arc, taking vastly different historical moments and threading them together.
It really is.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building entirely on the psychological challenge presented in this sermon.
Go for it.
We spent a lot of time discussing how the physical merchants were driven out of the temple and how the speaker applies that to driving spiritual complacency out of our internal lives today. So consider this. If your own mind, your own heart is the modern temple, where your deepest values and commitments are meant to thrive, what kind of merchandise is currently setting up shop in there?
Oh, that is good.
What daily distractions, what hidden hypocrisies, or what cynical transactional attitudes are taking up the space that was meant for genuine, unwavering connection?
That is a phenomenal question to carry with you today. What tables need overturning in your own life so you can get back to the heart of the matter?
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into such a complex and challenging piece of rhetoric. Keep asking great questions, keep exploring the ideas that shape our world, and we will catch you next time.